Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. So, today we're diving into a source that takes a story we all think we know and basically turns it completely upside down. You know, when we hear the name Dracula, we instantly picture what? Spooky castles, creeping shadows, classic horror, right? But our source material totally challenges all of that. It looks way past those surface-level scares to dig deep into the human mind. So get comfortable and let's explore this massive perspective shift together.
Okay, let's dive into this, because our source poses an absolutely fascinating first question. What if Dracula is not a monster story? I mean, really think about that for a second. We are so conditioned to categorize this narrative purely as horror, aren't we? We're trained to look at the vampire as this external threat, a literal monster coming from the outside to cause harm. But our analysis today starts by totally stripping away that monster label. By asking this exact question, the source material demands that we stop looking at the fangs and the bats and start looking at something far more profound. If he isn't just a monster meant to scare us, then what exactly is he?
But a psychological confession? I want you to just let the weight of that psychological reality land for a moment. A confession, an admission of something deeply hidden, something you really don't want the outside world to see. Our source suggests that instead of a simple tale of a monster in the dark, this is actually a profound unveiling of the human mind. It's an admission of truths that society desperately wanted to keep buried. This is a massive paradigm shift, guys. We are moving from a story about a creature hunting victims to a story about a society accidentally revealing its own deepest, darkest secrets.
Which brings us to Section 1, not just a monster.
So while this story is widely categorized as traditional horror fiction, and sure it functions perfectly well on that level to give you a good fright, its true beating heart is fundamentally about humanity. It's about how we process our thoughts, how we deal with the things we aren't supposed to feel, and what happens when those things finally bubble up to the surface. To really grasp this, we have to understand the primary psychological mechanism at play here, which is repression. According to the source, this isn't just some general psychological concept, it is specifically the Victorian societal standard of hiding desire and restraining emotion. Imagine living in a world where your natural desires absolutely must be tucked away, where any strong surge of emotion is seen as a flaw that has to be restrained. That is the heavy, suffocating blanket of repression. And the key takeaway here is that Dracula is the instrument that ultimately shatters that standard. He's basically the hammer that breaks the glass of this psychological containment.
And that leads us right into Section 2, the Victorian cage.
To truly appreciate the force of that shattering, we have to look at the glass itself. We need to understand the strict historical and social environment that actually necessitated this extreme level of psychological repression. The source material paints a very specific picture of the Victorian social context. It wasn't just polite, it was an environment built fundamentally on restriction. Think of it as a societal cage designed to keep the messy, unpredictable parts of human nature securely locked away from public view. Look at the rules of this society. They were built on absolute control. Desire was strictly hidden. Emotion was entirely restrained. There is literally no room for flexibility here. The phrasing from our source is absolute, control, hidden, restrained. It is an incredibly rigid framework for living. If you were part of this society, these were the non-negotiable rules. You do not show what you want. You do not show what you feel. Everything absolutely must be perfectly managed on the surface.
Moving on to Section 3, a force of awakening.
Now, a cage that tight creates immense pressure. I mean, imagine that incredibly stiff, controlled environment we just talked about. Now introduce a fluid, chaotic energy, an element that absolutely refuses to play by those rules. The source describes Dracula as a force that cannot be controlled. The vampire represents the ultimate rule breaker in a society where rules are literally everything. Think back to the absolute control of that Victorian cage. Dracula is the exact antithesis of that. He is this disruptive element that bypasses their social manners, completely ignores their restraints, and just acts on pure, unfiltered impulse. He enters that world like a force of nature that simply cannot be managed, negotiated with, or repressed.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the source maps out his impact in a very specific three-step progression. Step 1, he enters the controlled world. Okay, so we establish the disruption. But step 2 is where the shift really happens. He does not just attack people. If he merely attacked them, well, he'd just be that literal monster we talked about at the very beginning. It's step 3 that changes the whole shebang. He awakens something inside them. This is the psychological core right here. He isn't just taking something away from his victims, he's bringing something out of them. He is awakening those hidden desires and restrained emotions that the Victorian cage tried so hard to lock away.
He essentially acts as a catalyst for their own buried psychology.
Next up is Section 4, Fear versus Attraction.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive, complicated mess of feelings this awakening creates. Because when a society is suddenly faced with a force that brings out everything they've been taught to repress, the response is deeply divided. On the surface, there's obvious fear of the external threat, which, makes sense. That's the socially acceptable response. Of course you're afraid of the vampire. That is what society allows you to admit in public. But hidden beneath that, there is a deep attraction to the liberation he represents. The source points out that people are actually drawn to the very thing that shatters their repressed cages. They are attracted to the freedom of finally abandoning absolute control. This intense friction perfectly captures the conflict between what society publicly admits and what it privately, deeply desires.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that this complex mix of emotions is actually the source of the vampire's strength. As our source breaks down, his power is fueled equally by desire, fear, and curiosity. His power doesn't just come from supernatural abilities, right? It comes from the fact that he represents what society absolutely refuses to admit. He's an amalgamation of all these unacknowledged feelings mixed together into one being. He's literally the embodiment of their hidden desires, their obvious fears, and their deeply repressed curiosity about what lies just beyond the rules of society.
Which brings us to our final point in Section 5, internal conflict made visible.
We've traced the repression, the cage, the awakening, and that incredibly complex mix of fear and attraction. Now the source pulls all these threads together to unveil the ultimate psychological truth. So the crucial point is this quote right here. Dracula is not external evil, he is internal conflict made visible. And there it is. The paradigm shift is complete. We are completely leaving behind the idea of the literal monster and fully embracing the metaphor. He's not an outside threat coming to destroy a perfect society. He is a mirror reflecting a society that is already fractured from within. He is the walking, breathing manifestation of their own repressed desires, their own restrained emotions, and their own hidden attractions. The horror isn't that a monster is breaking into the house. The horror is that the monster was actually inside their minds the entire time, just waiting to be made visible.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought. If Dracula represents Victorian society's hidden desires and repressed conflicts, what do our modern monsters say about us? Today's psychological interpretation requires us to look at the stories we're telling right now. I mean, sure, we might not live in a strict Victorian cage anymore, but we still have fears, we still have hidden desires, and we still create monsters to represent them. So what internal conflicts are we currently making visible on our screens and in our books? It's a fascinating question to ponder. Thank you so much for exploring this psychological confession with me today in this explainer. Keep questioning the stories you think you know, and I'll see you next time.